want to thank you all and welcome you to our webinar, Why is Evaluation So White? With Vidhya Shanker and Carolina de la Rosa Mateo. My name is Albertina Lopez. I am a senior associate with the Center for Evaluation Innovation, and I'm joined with my colleagues at CEI. So Julia Kaufman, Mariah Brophy-Gantz, and Kat Athanasiades are working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this all happen. And Tanya Beer and I will be co-facilitating today. So we'll probably be spending about most of our time with Vidhya and Carolina presenting their work. And then we have a good chunk of time too towards the end for a lot of Q&A and some discussion. So just a little bit of a few bullet points about how we want to Zoom today. So, you know, we are here talking about race. And for many people, that can be uncomfortable. And there's lots of thoughts and feelings and perceptions and experiences and a lot of variance around what that's like for people. And we are also talking about it in a field that I think many of us really care about. And that, you know, this field of evaluation and the system that we are all kind of a part of as individuals. So I want to encourage us to listen deeply and really just to listen to understand. Make space for disagreement. You can accept that others see things in a different way than you do, and that's okay. Be willing to be uncomfortable. There is an opportunity that could happen, and you know, maybe it's a space that you can lean into and an opportunity for growth and learning. And a little bit on the technical side, just use the Q&A function as we go. Everyone is on mute, but we really do want to hear from you. So as questions come up, we want to encourage you to use that Q&A function. And then, you know, we have one that's not on here, but that I wanted to add from the Interaction Institute for Social Change. And it's about expecting and accepting a lack of closure. So, you know, we might leave this webinar with more questions than answers. And then that's really okay. We're not going to be dismantling the system, right, that we are all a part of in one day. But encourage us all to kind of expect that lack of closure and just to keep an eye out for any questions, thoughts, and ideas that you can really kind of build upon in the future. So I am very honored to introduce Vidhya and Carolina today. I was introduced to Vidhya through her blog post a few months ago, and I just felt so much gratitude about her work and her desire to lift up the voices of women of color and Indigenous women in our field. And Vidhya's content really helped me and colleagues at CEI really think about our own assumptions about why the field looks as it does. Vidhya has 20 years of research and evaluation, training and facilitation, and operations and management experience, working independently with large institutions and with grassroots organizations in the US and internationally on the intersections of globalization, poverty, and violence, particularly for women of color and Indigenous women. She has particular interest in using evaluation as a vehicle for organizational learning within social movements and funding agencies. Vidhya has a PhD in evaluation studies from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. As a graduate of AEA's JEDI internship, Carolina earned her master's in public health from the University of Minnesota in 2019. Carolina was born in the Dominican Republic, but spent most of her life in Florida before moving to Minnesota for graduate school. Her lived experience as an immigrant living in Spanish-only speaking household and living with a sibling with a disability pushed her to really work in the health field and to work toward a world in which all people have equal access to a full and healthy life. So without further ado, I turn it over to Vidhya and Carolina.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank you all for talking about this today in the midst of a crisis, and I will get into, I have a few acknowledgments considering that my, part of my point is about invisible labor. And I wanted to start with acknowledging that right at this moment, I'm presenting to you from unceded Dakota land. I also wanted to acknowledge Ahmaud Arbery and all the Black lives lost as part of the formal and informal policing of Black body, Black scholarship, Black activism. And I wanted to acknowledge African American scholarship, organizing, and activism in general. Not only is it giving me my civil rights right now, but it has given me a lot of the theoretical and analytical tools that I'm exercising today, as has all of the and underpaid labor of dispossessed and displaced people, and the labor of my daughter's teachers, many of whom are also parents, and it's because of them that I'm able to present today. I also really wanted to thank the Center for Evaluation and Innovation, because I did not think that I could pull this together while homeschooling in about a month. And it's thanks to their efforts, really largely, that it came together. Okay, so I know that it's difficult to take time away from homeschooling and caring for elders and sick folks and other very pressing concerns, and thinking about our long-term future as individuals. Things can seem at odds with each other, and I'm hoping that the way that Carolina and I have approached today's presentation shows how closely connected they are, because we have organized the presentation by the sections named in the blurb. We'll start with why there are so few evaluators of color, and or why is evaluation so white, how evaluation has approached race, the implications of that approach, and the promise of generative networks as illustrated by the one that we are starting in Minnesota. And so when we discuss these things, we're going to be talking about it at multiple levels. The approach to race is in terms of the demographic composition of the field, but also about the way that the field talks about race and writes about race, and about the field's practice through the eyes of practitioners of color and Indigenous practitioners. And so we've started a presentation, we've approached the presentation, I should say, as a journey. Both of our journeys, from how we got to where we are now, and where we dream of going. And it includes personal stories from the two of us, but also the stories contributed by members of our community of Praxis that we've started, and interviews from my dissertation and literature that framed my dissertation. And so because my journey starts a couple of decades before Carolina's, I will start and she will meet me midway, as we did in fact meet a couple of years ago. And those of you who might have read the blog entry that was linked to, I think, on the email, you already know that I'm often asked by people of all kinds, all racial classifications, why there are so few people of color in evaluation. And in thinking about that, I thought about the similarly difficult questions that my daughter asks me. My daughter was born right when I completed my preliminary written exams. As I was conducting my dissertation research, she was in daycare, and then, because it took me so long, she was in pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade. And so many of you may know that children become aware of race by age 3. And so she, like many other children, would ask about the patterns that she saw. And like many of you, I found myself having to explain, why all the teachers at her preschool were white and why all the kids in our neighborhood were not. I also had to explain to her why the African-American kids in her school and in her neighborhood that she thought looked just like her cousins and her don't speak Mende, which is her father and grandmother's language. I even had to explain to her that she was not American Indian. Which she insisted that she was, because she felt the same as the Native community that envelops us here in our neighborhood, which is the birthplace of the American Indian movement. And this was especially difficult because, in addition to being West African, she's Asian Indian from my side. We can't notice these patterns, right, unless we also notice difference and repetition. So what she's remarking on is the repeated association with certain kinds of bodies in certain kinds of roles. And not all differences result in a pattern, but when we see a pattern, we're noticing the repetition with respect to difference, whether we say it out loud or not, right? My Facebook memories tell me that 2 years ago, when my daughter was in first grade, she brought home a book about Jackie Robinson. And I offered to read it to her that night, and she said with a big grin that I didn't need to, that she had already read it. And she proceeded to tell me that it was just like my dissertation. And she's in first grade. According to my Facebook post at the time, I looked at her quizzically, and I didn't know what she was talking about. And she opened up the book to a 2-page spread in the middle featuring African-American men wearing baseball uniforms, as if the answer should be obvious to me. And so I don't know anything about sports. I never talk about them. The last time I told this story, I mixed up basketball and baseball, just so you know. So it never occurred to me that she could make the leap from baseball to my work, because I've not talked about my dissertation with her either. So in response to my still incredulous look, she said, "Civil rights, Mom, it's about civil rights. They didn't used to allow brown people to play baseball." Narrative is the way that we make sense of and solidify, internalize, and subsequently reproduce the patterns that we perceive. Through what I've started to call the pedagogy of motherhood, I realized that most kids are shushed when they notice what we're not supposed to notice, when they ask about or talk about what we're not supposed to talk about. And so while I had never discussed my directly, I had always answered her questions honestly. And as a result, her innate critical literacy, which I think that all of us have, had been affirmed and was growing. And in that sense, it was an amplifying feedback loop. And so I realized that the only training that I had received to do this was from my own parents, who I'm so grateful had both historicized and contextualized lots of patterns that I saw. And when we were growing up, there were a few Asian Americans, especially South Asian Americans in the Midwestern suburbs. And until high school, when we were subject to distinctly Asian American stereotypes and slurs, throughout the late 1960s and early 70s, during the era of busing, we were racialized as Black. And so we got a crash course in intersectionality and solidarity, thanks to my parents, who felt kinship with their African American neighbors, despite being from the oppressive caste in India. And so they were the first ones to tell us about Martin Luther King, and their answers to our questions did not stop there. I have a vivid memory of seeing Yasser Arafat on the news when I must have been less than 10, based on the house that I remember being in. And I remember my dad, I remember telling my dad that he looked scary and asking if he was a bad guy. And even though I don't remember anything that my dad actually said, I remember him taking the time out to explain a bit of Yasser Arafat's story to me, so that I no longer just saw a scary bad guy through the lens of US media, but I saw a human being with a story attached to him. But this is not how we in evaluation have approached difficult questions about race. We have not affirmed and subsequently grown scholarship and practice that asks and answers such difficult questions. Okay, so this is a chance for you all to plug into the chat again. Does anyone know what happened on May 12th? It was the May 12th group first meeting. Those of you who have been trained in the history and theory of evaluation may know that the origins of what is now the American Evaluation Association, which is the only remaining professional association for evaluators, lie in what's called the May 12th group, which was named after the date of the first meeting. I don't know how many of us were alive at the time. I was not quite yet alive. Those of you who were in the mid to late 60s, we don't have actually a very specific date for the first one, but you can think about what was going on in your lives and in the world at that time. This was all part of the implementation of the Great Society programming, which started in direct response to civil rights agitation, the Moynihan Report, and corresponding legislation. Does anyone know why it was called the May 12th group? So the group was named as such so it would have absolutely zero cachet, and so no one will be able to argue that they were entitled to join the May 12th group because it's called something generic. And so the idea was you got invited to the May 12th group, and if you weren't invited, then you weren't in. And so there was no official stuff. And if you've read, I know this is blasphemy to be quoting Scriven this way, but if you have read the oral histories of that generation, all of whom were part of the May 12th group, almost all of them talk about the naming this way, and it's usually received with a lot of humor. Lincoln and Guba then say the program evaluation community was so small in the late 1960s and early 1970s that virtually everyone who was writing about evaluation could be invited to the May 12th group and accommodated comfortably. And so While there is no published roster or documentation of the demographics of the group, and I did look for my dissertation, none of those who were present, who were recollected by members interviewed, has been identified as African American or as a member of any racially otherized group. Although Hood and Hobson have documented African American evaluators practicing and publishing as early as the 1940s. And they've been doing this through the Nobody Knows My Name project. They were publishing where they had access to publish, which was typically the Journal of Negro Education. And they're absent from the May 12 group, and they were not part of the community. They were not invited. 40 years later, in 2004, Marv Alkin cemented evaluation's canon in the famous, I dare say sacred, evaluation tree. The scholars invited to the May 12 group had developed networks and critical connections within a tight ecosystem that included government agencies, higher education institutions, nonprofit organizations, and philanthropy. Members cited each other and shared economic opportunities with each other. The imagery of a single tree hides the surrounding ecosystem that was involved in generating each member's scholarship and careers. So you can imagine, the full ecosystem. It makes knowledge production look like it's interpersonally transmitted, like a family tree, right? Instead of generated through an ecosystem that includes higher education institutions, government agencies, journals, professional associations, and philanthropic foundations. And so when I talk about a system, I'm talking about a group of parts or actors that are interconnected as a web and that relate to, depend on, and interact with each other to form a complex whole. The whole is both different from and greater than the sum of all the individual parts. This image on the left is of brain synapses, by the way. The structure of the system mediates how the parts are interrelated, how a stock flows from one actor to another within it. And the parts or actors constituting a system are interrelated in complicated ways, as you can see, that can make it difficult to identify what caused what, because causes and effects can be multiple and multi-directional. Systems have a purpose in the sense that the parts co-constituting them work together in a way that produces a certain outcome. So we're forced to ask, right, if the May 12th group constituted a system embedded within larger ecosystems, what outcome does that system produce? What does its structure produce? A system will continue to produce the same outcome unless and until a change is made in some aspect of the actors, the connections among them, or the boundary containing them that bears high leverage. High leverage points are those in which a small shift has the potential to produce a big shift in the system's dynamics, and then the outcomes, because of how the parts and the actors are related across space and time. So what is systems thinking? That's what I'm trying to use throughout this presentation and what I tried to use in my dissertation. The image on the right is of a mandala, or kolam, as we call it in Tamil. My grandmother made a kolam like this with rice flour at the threshold of her house every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk. She would wash away the morning kolam and then make a new one, like all of the other women in her community. Kolam making grows out of an indigenous knowledge system that does not distinguish process from product. It does not separate math, art, entomology, and spirituality. And it is passed down as a practice intergenerationally among women. In the same way, systems thinking involves viewing situations in ways that challenge reduction to individual parts by seeing the parts in a system not as individual, but rather as constituent agents that are interconnected and that interact to co-create particular outcomes. It involves paying close attention to the ways that the constituent agents are interconnected and interact, and the role that the system structures play in mediating those relations. Within a system, the flow of stock can change the amount of that stock in ways that influence the rate or nature of the flow itself, making any more changes in the amount either more or less likely. These are called feedback loops. In stabilizing feedback loops, initial changes are counteracted so that things stay pretty much the same. Achievement of the product discourages processes that created it. In amplifying feedback loops, initial changes become magnified over time. Achievement of the product encourages the processes that created it. No amplifying loop can sustainably last forever, though. If we think about the May 12 group as a system embedded within larger systems, we can start to map out some of the flows of stock and feedback loops within it. And these are oversimplifications, of course, but we can start to think about the system's reaction to evaluators from racially otherized groups, especially those addressing racialized difference in their scholarship, as stabilizing and resistant to change, in that such scholars' work was rarely engaged with. And so it was not built upon or cited. After all, that's what we've seen in educational and residential desegregation efforts, kind of like weeds being plucked out of a garden. The few racially otherized members to enter an explicitly white space eventually tire out and leave. And we can think about the scholarship among evaluators racially normatized as white as feeding off each other, quite literally. They build off each other's scholarship and they cite each other. And citations are like currency in the academic world and in a knowledge producing field like evaluation. They have material consequences, right? So remember that an amplifying feedback loop could have desired as well as undesired effects, as we can see right now in COVID-19, where our interconnectedness can spread the virus as much as it can fuel mutual aid efforts. So these everyday routinized patterns of exclusionary behaviors in evaluation actively produced and accumulated whiteness. And by whiteness, I don't necessarily mean white skin color, but rather whiteness as a racialized construct that encompasses notions of individual agency and merit. And so I know this is a lot, and we thought it might make sense to take a few minutes to pause and reflect. This exercise is inspired by a webinar I attended by the Mashpee Wampanoag Nation around the disestablishment by the Department of Interior, where they, in their webinar, they said that we cannot effectively advocate for what we don't actually feel in our bones. And so in that spirit, we thought it might make sense for us to spend a few minutes thinking, drawing, or writing about a time when we felt our values or knowledge or ways of doing things, ways of being that we brought with us to work were in conflict with or in congruence with what was expected of us at work, and or when we received a negative reaction to our exercise of those values, knowledge, ways of doing things, ways of being, or when we exerted a negative reaction, or when we felt that we had full authority to exercise our whole beings, or when we felt we had no authority. So if you want to take a few minutes to reflect on that, we'd love to see any insights in the chat, and then we'll reconvene in about 2 minutes. Okay, so feel free to continue reflecting on that. We will not debrief right now, but we will have time at the end. So we're going to move to the next section. How has evaluation approached race? And in the meanwhile, we're going to hear from one of our local community of practice members.
Hey everyone, my name's Carolina. I'll be talking a little bit more later on, but as we go through this presentation, we're going to be sharing a few examples of some of the obstacles evaluators of color constantly are up against in the workplace. So I'm going to share this vignette with you first. It reads, as an evaluation consultant, I worked on a project that affected my community of color directly in terms of curriculum development based on findings about cultural pride and academics. My white cohort members saw nothing wrong with measuring my community's pride with indicators such as time and duration of speaking an ethnic language, dancing an ethnic dance, and eating ethnic foods, literally noting egg rolls eaten. I voiced concern multiple times throughout the project and with frustration questioned if waving an American flag, counting how many apple pies and hot dogs eaten equated to their college placement. The project continued and I was no longer an employee.
And so, as people who like to think of ourselves as educated, we often dismiss race as a social construction without really thinking about the process of construction. Shun is a Latin suffix used to form abstract nouns from verbs to express action, a state, or associated meanings. Construction is a nominal form of the verb to construct. Being the noun form of a verb, construction is an act that requires actors. Evaluators actively construct race, whether we talk about it or not. After a quick overview of how we as a field have constructed race, we're going to talk about the actors and the actions involved in the process and the implications for generative networks. So my dissertation research found that the field of evaluation has used the discourses of culture, diversity, and inclusion to signify racialized difference. And to be clear, all of these discourses started with an interest in justice, but they proliferated exponentially. And I'll get to when and how in the next section. All three obscure rather than illuminate understanding of racialized difference. And so they can be characterized as liberal rather than critical discourses of race. The growth of these discourses stunted the growth of a theoretically and empirically grounded critical tradition that had started and that might have generated understanding of racialized difference, what Lonnie Grenier calls racial literacy, with the analytical specificity necessary to repair and reverse intergenerational and systemic oppression within our field and the fields that depend on us. So an analysis of more than 5,000 articles from US peer-reviewed evaluation literature revealed the following three distinct patterns of language more specifically. And each of these patterns could and should actually be a webinar by itself. I'm just listing them now so that we can see how they have real implications as they are playing out in real time during COVID-19. And the point here is that how we write and talk about race has real consequences for real people. One pervasive pattern is the normatizing of whiteness as a frame of reference without ever acknowledging white culture and codes of whiteness. The extreme manifestation of this pattern is white nationalism and xenophobia, which we see now in the failure to distinguish between Asian nationals and Asian Americans, but also among Asian nations, right? Because we as a society and we in evaluation act as if race is real, even though we keep saying it's a social construction. The second pattern is the replacement of race with culture, which allows racial disparities and disproportionalities to be explained by cultural deficits and pathology. And the best thing about this example is that it shows how racially otherized folks, BIPOC ourselves, can internalize and reproduce narratives of difference that uphold white supremacist structures. The last pattern is the rise of both indigeneity and colonization. In the earliest years when indigeneity was being written about by scholars who did not identify as indigenous, they never acknowledged colonization. And the implications of this pattern are the literal and figurative genocide and erasure of indigenous peoples. Later on, scholars who did identify themselves as indigenous explicitly increasingly wrote about indigeneity, and they often refused to define indigeneity in terms of colonization. And this distinction becomes important later on as the difference between a cautionary tale and some hope for evaluation. So again, there's a lot more I could say about each of these, and I'm hoping that I will have that opportunity soon enough. But the two things I'm hoping you walk away with are how we as evaluators think and talk about race has direct consequences for human beings, and that this knowledge about how racialized narratives play out in real people's lives is subjugated and indigenous knowledge. It comes from struggles against colonization, enslavement, and war. Many evaluators from racially otherized groups still have this knowledge, but we are typically blocked from using it. The world needs this knowledge now more than ever, I would argue. And for our knowledge to be able to grow and be channeled in such a way that it can influence our industry and the industries that depend on evaluation, we need structures that will create feedback loops like the ones we saw earlier to affirm and amplify it. We also need structures that will create feedback loops that stabilize damaging narratives.
So I'm going to share another example from one of our community of practice colleagues. The quote reads, "One of the predominantly white companies in which I worked decided to hire a consultant to further its internal and external DEI efforts. I asked to be included in the selection process to share my perspective on some of the systems changes I was hoping a consultant would address based on my experience living, learning, and working as a member of an oppressed racial group in predominantly white settings. They said no. I was told I could have input, but could not be included in decision-making because I didn't know business. When I suggested to include all employees in DEI efforts and not just employees from one division, I was told that DEI is not relevant to some positions. When I shared ideas with coworkers about how to improve equity internally and in project work, I was accused of creating a counterculture in the organization. At the same time my company was stating its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was excluding me, one of only 2 employees of color at the time, from decision-making and reprimanding me for talking with coworkers about DEI. Diversifying the field of evaluation to create systems change only goes as far as the white companies are willing to take it. And they added a little bit of an explanation to their vignette just to expand. So I'm going to read their quote, which is not on screen. To the point in my vignette, even if we select to work at organizations that are committed to equity and inclusion, we have no way of knowing ahead of time if that commitment is authentic or an ornament to attract proposals and diverse employees. That is not an effective recipe for systems change. We need organizations with leadership that represents us, that sees us, that values us, and the knowledge we bring that believes us.
Okay, so how did we get here? I did a document analysis and interviews, and I found in my dissertation that the field's discursive move away from any theoretical or analytical specificity with respect to race, like so many things, right, was not an accident. This is a dissertation interviewee quotation. Around 1999 to 2000, there was a national backlash on equal opportunity. The backlash on affirmative action created a new language that got away from race and started talking about inclusion and diversity. So again, those of you who were alive at the time, and I was alive at the time, can think about what was going on in your life and in the world at large. And this was before 9/11, right after so-called welfare reform, during Clinton's second term, when a lot of colleges and universities, including my own, the University of Michigan, were being sued by white women, the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action, for accepting so-called minorities who were supposedly less qualified than them. And another quotation is that once an idea gets out in the main discourse, it's taken on by the whole industry. So there was a conscious shift in America trying to get away from the realities of race disparities, between race and ethnic disparities, between non-white ethnic groups and racial groups. And so if you do inclusion, then you could include white women. Someone went on. They had this diversity task force, and this is within AEA. They had this diversity task force, and they asked the MIE, that is the multi-ethnic, at that time it was the minority issues in evaluation, TIG, to be involved with it. But of course they were going to control it. This quotation was fairly clearly tied. It was not unique, okay? This idea was fairly clearly tied to concrete material decisions and documents that my interviewees tied to larger discourses of racialized neoliberalization. So in other words, the shift in language was artificially produced, just like racialized difference itself, right, which was artificially produced through the eugenics movement and earlier, but our field is directly related to the eugenics movement. That is, it's part of evaluation's origin story. And so it's important to note that these patterns were not limited to AEA affiliated publications, that the patterns of language regarding racialized difference throughout the field coincided with AEA decisions and documents regarding racialized difference, suggesting that the professional association has an influence on the field beyond its membership. And we can see this when we look at the revised international tree. This is the international tree that was published 8 years after the first in 2012. So even though the values branch now lists Donna Mertens, okay, it is missing numerous scholars who have contributed meaningfully to evaluation's understanding of race through their scholarship and through practice. And so we say, there are so few evaluators of color, or there aren't any evaluators of color, but we do not talk about Anna Madison, who started the minority issues in evaluation TIG during the presidency of Bob Covert, who supported it fully. We don't talk about David Chavis and Kian Lee, who designed and implemented the Building Diversity Initiative study. We don't talk about Ricardo Millet, who funded the Building Diversity Initiative study when he was at Kellogg, or Elmima Johnson, who funded portions of the recommendations through her role at NSF. We do not talk about Melvin Hall. We are recently talking more about Melvin Hall, thank goodness, who led implementation of the recommendations that came out of the Building Diversity Initiative. and Hazel Simonet, who was chair of the MIE-TIG at the time. Both have contributed probably every single year since then to the field's understanding and practice regarding racialized difference. Stafford Hood was the first to apply critical race theory to the field of evaluation. That means not just using critical race theory in evaluation, which is revolutionary in and of itself, but actually turning the lens back on evaluation. He and Rodney Hobson have been documenting the contributions of African-American evaluators over the last century or so. Denise Ward Hood and Denise Casaro are the first, and to my knowledge, only, I did go through 5,000 articles, right? So only authors to have named and explored the topics of white supremacy, intersectionality, and Black feminist thought in evaluation. They are basically invisible. And it's worth adding that Denise Casaro is the first, and to my knowledge, only scholar in evaluation who has identified as queer and brought queer theory into evaluation scholarship. Jerry Peake conducted the only evaluation of the Building Diversity Initiative. James Davis wrote about the problems with using race as an explanatory variable way back in the 90s. Joan LaFrance played a pivotal role in establishing the Indigenous Peoples in Evaluation TIG, which dramatically changed evaluation's understanding of indigeneity and colonization, which I get to later. And Veronica Thomas has brought together culturally responsive evaluation with systems-oriented evaluation. And I haven't done any of these careers justice, by the way. I do want to do oral histories on all of them, and I do want a whole posse to do these oral histories. So if anybody wants to join me, that's another conversation. But the point I'm trying to make is that we say there aren't any, right? AEA essentially constituted a system, again, nested within a larger system known as the nonprofit industrial complex, which was embedded within a larger context of government deregulation, devolution, and racialized neoliberalization. We can think about the feedback loop. It provided networks and critical connections. You know, like one of the quotations said, the level and the structure within the system matters, right? So she made the point that they were going to control it. They asked for MIE-TIG's help, but they were going to control it, essentially displacing the knowledge that the MIE-TIG had through its lived experience and through its experience doing this kind of work, recruiting evaluators of color and training membership at large on issues of bias. Fundamentally changing the compensatory focus on justice, right, to a business case for diversity. So it broadened, instead of talking about race, it broadened it to include dimensions of difference, which represents a preservation of homeostasis, right, relative to AEA's surroundings in terms of government agencies, higher educational institutions, that kind of thing, because a lot of the movers and shakers in AEA were in academic positions. So the culture of whiteness that evaluators have actively constructed within the field could not and still does not see all of those faces that I just showed you. Their work is rendered illegible. It's operating at a different frequency that they don't even hear. And yet their work is what allows people like me to do our work, right, in a sea of whiteness, and gives us the courage to resist accusations that we are the problem. So all of the critical knowledge that the scholars that I just went through brought with them from their communities and their histories was never affirmed or expanded upon. It's diversity, inclusion, and culture that were cited and cited and cited and cited. Many of the interviewees said that they were identified or selected by AEA leaders for diversity-related task forces and committees and presentations and publications at AEA conference keynotes, and actually also at a Canadian Evaluation Society conference. They had very specific years that they mentioned, which provided networks and cultivated critical connections. And so liberal discourse with respect to race was amplified through the networks and critical connections. As a counterexample, though, the Indigenous Peoples in Evaluation Topical Interest Group was established between about 2003 and 2005 for the full establishment to take place. Its work was never co-opted by AEA's board, was not elevated or broadened. We can see with respect to scholarship on Indigenous peoples in evaluation, a dramatic change in frequency and in the nature, in the way that indigeneity is discussed, starting exactly between 2003 and 2005 to the present day to, last, I want to say fall, when an entire issue of New Directions was devoted to Indigenous evaluation. As we kind of close out this section, I just wanted to wrap up. There have been other attempts at creating networks and critical connections in evaluation through cohorts, including the Robert Wood Johnson Evaluation Fellowship. Annie E. Casey's are still going on, and the Kellogg-funded Building Diversity Initiative, which is also still going on. Carolina was a JEDI graduate, and so she'll talk about that in a second, but I just wanted to include some perspective on these efforts in that Can Lee, and who was author of the original Building Diversity Initiative study, and Brandy Gilbert, who is a current coordinator of JEDI, along with Rodney Hobson, they called on the evaluation community to move beyond the individual and consider the interconnected parts of the ecosystem, i.e. organizational policies and practices, institutional norms that made it necessary for the programs in the first place, and thus play a role in the change process. Focusing on and affecting individuals, the student or intern in particular, is less threatening than challenging policies and practices that have been in place for generations. Okay, so we're going to get into the community of practice as soon as we hear from another member.
So before I get into my story, I'm going to go ahead and share another example. So the quote reads, "Our team, 3 white colleagues and myself, insisted they consider doing focus groups or more participatory methods to hear from these specific communities. The agency was stubborn and torn between a desire to replicate the survey that was done in previous years so as to have a point of comparison, and adopting an approach that would yield the type of information on POC that would influence better programming decisions. They opted for the survey, and no surprise, we had an overwhelming response rate from white Americans and not enough responses from POC to make generalization of any subgroup of the population. In the end, we conducted the analysis and reporting of results. I was able to convince my team on the importance of not bucketing the responses of people who define themselves as Chinese or as Korean as the same thing, Asians, in an effort to please the client. While the research team was convinced of my point of view, I felt I had to fight for it, and as a POC, it was a very emotionally draining experience. With tears and all, in thinking of my own identity and how I've always dreaded the survey question on race ethnicity, I felt it was all coming to haunt me then. So now I'm going to share a little bit about me. My upbringing was very different from Vidya's. Pictured here are me. This is the first day of kindergarten, I believe, and with my mom. And I did not grow up in a household where racism was ever discussed, though it's clear to me, as I reflect on it now, that my family had internalized racism that they passed down to me, and that I'm still honestly working on understanding and challenging today. I grew up in a somewhat homogeneous area, but in a different way. I think Vidya mentioned in the intro, or maybe Ali mentioned it in my introduction, that I grew up in Miami, which is predominantly Hispanic and Latine, and acknowledge that there's definitely a lot of diversity there, but we do have this shared language, and I felt a lot of community and with those around me and didn't necessarily feel different. I do remember a few instances of racism with white passing classmates in elementary school, but aside from that, race wasn't really something at the forefront of my mind. And when I reflect on it now, I can say that it really was ingrained in my thought process and in many of the decisions I made, even if I didn't understand that then. However, it wasn't until I went to college and started taking public health classes that I really started thinking purposely about race, but it was still through a deficit lens, in part because that's how academia talks about race. I learned a lot about disparities, but not the why of those disparities. And I'll say that even in my graduate program in public health, I never really learned the why of disparities. Fast forward a few years, in other words, last year, I participated in the Graduate Education Diversity Internship, more commonly known as the JEDI program, during my second year of grad school. And I was part of cohort 15, Tenacious 10, pictured here. I really enjoyed my experience, and I'm super grateful for the connections I was able to make through it, both at my host site and the broader evaluation community. We had a crash course in evaluation theory and methods, and we went back to our host sites and other places of employment to apply these skills. But that was a little bit difficult to do because even though my supervisor, or rather supervisors at various organizations, because it wasn't just one, I had supervisors that advocated for my ideas, I was never in a position with decision-making power, and neither were my supervisors. And even though I had the data to back up what I was saying or suggesting, those that were in those positions of power did what they thought was right, regardless of whether they were hearing otherwise. So I'll share an example. At one of my workplaces, I conducted a qualitative study to get feedback from community organizations and leaders on what programming changes they would like my organization to make to better serve the community. We conducted in-depth interviews in which the interviewees offered recommendations and explained the barriers that prevented them from benefiting from the program as it currently was. I presented the results to the director that had requested the study and who was in a position of power, but this director disregarded the findings and decided that the organization was going to go in a different direction, one that wasn't necessarily supported by the findings and kind of the direction they wanted to go in even before this study. So what was the point of having me do that work if what the findings said didn't matter to leadership? Ultimately, it didn't matter that I or my supervisor were both women of color, or that we had evidence that the community members had suggestions for how they thought the program could feasibly be changed to best serve their needs. We were powerless, and I felt that right away, and I didn't really know what to do about it. Fast forward to just a few months ago, one of my work colleagues, her name's Tia, and she will be part of the Q&A panel later, told me about an opportunity to be an actor for a short play that was part of a larger professional development workshop. To me, it sounded like a really fun opportunity, and I was intrigued by the title, which was "The Revolution Will Not Be Culturally Competent." But truthfully, what I hoped more than anything by being a part of this was that I would, one, meet other evaluators of color, and two, that they would talk about how they were making changes at their organizations or what I could do to advocate for more community-driven evaluations. And honestly, I walked away from the workshop disappointed, but disappointed over the fact that it was over and wishing that the conversation would continue. But lucky for me, it did. Vidhya, our colleagues Tia and Anne, and I decided to debrief on the workshop afterwards. And we decided we wanted to take things a step further. And purely by chance, we came across another colleague named Cassie, who had a similar desire to create a network of IBPOC evaluators. So we started talking, and a month after that workshop, we had our first Community of Praxis meeting. So just to give you some context for those of you that don't live in Minnesota, Minnesota is home to the largest urban Indigenous population, some of the highest refugee populations. It has some of the highest numbers of nonprofits, philanthropic foundations, and evaluators. And it is one of the most racially disparate and racially segregated states in the country. So as our Community of Praxis developed, our core planning team, which consisted of myself and all the individuals I just mentioned, established what we wanted this group to be about. And really what we wanted was for it to be for and by those that identify as Indigenous, Black, people of color, and any identity from groups that continue to be harmed by and excluded from US systems, specifically the ongoing racialized traumas associated with white supremacy. We wanted it to be community driven and let the needs of our colleagues drive the work, acknowledging that we all have different work contexts and different levels of experience with evaluation and understanding greater systemic issues. We wanted to connect IBPOC evaluators in our community, and we're super excited to see that our list of colleagues expressing interest in participating in this group grew to 70 people within just the first 2 months. And we wanted to be action-oriented and go beyond having conversations about the obstacles we are constantly trying to overcome. To make this as collaborative and community-driven as possible, for our first 3 meetings, we added questions to our registration form, asking attendees to write out suggestions for guiding principles they would like the group to embrace together, and topics around evaluation and race, colonization, war, power dynamics, or systems change that they would like to see the group address. And we took both of these questions and organized them into categories to help us see what our colleagues wanted out of this group. On this slide, we shared the guiding principles that came out of their suggestions, which include respect, honesty, balance, listening, learning, and application. And here are the overarching topics of interest. Our group members shared many specific examples, so these are very high level and cover a wide variety of needs, including organizational change to support IBPOC in the workplace, to conducting more community-centered evaluations and creating connections to self-care. So I won't read them all, but you'll see we have coalition building and leveraging collective impact, measurement issues, evaluation with Indigenous communities, so quite a variety of topics. And as we continue to establish and grow the group, our internal planning committee continues to think about how we can support our colleagues and continue to facilitate relationships that can help our colleagues navigate some of the issues that are presented on the slide. So what we soon realized was that we were growing a generative network. And a generative network is a network of individuals and organizations that collectively and adaptively generate loops of activities and effects to tackle large-scale, complex, and unpredictable problems. And they combine powerful social dynamics, so the basic human desire to connect, share, belong, and make a difference, with a decentralized structure that enables members to amplify their efforts. And they set two social forces into motion: the generosity with which members treat each other and the shared sense of identity they develop. All right, so now that I've shared those kind of high-level points about our group, I'm going to give it back to Vidhya to expand on our generative network.
Carolina actually has another vignette to share.
So this is another vignette from one of our colleagues. It reads, "I always believed that the barriers I faced was linked to my approach, which is not solely guided by statistics and data. My approach is based in the human experience. For 7 years working in state government, I have politely pressed my point in a variety of evaluation roles. A recent agency-wide swing towards a focus on equity was originally greeted with a kind of reticence by all my white colleagues. They shift and find more personally comfortable ways to address the issue. Still, the focus is sterile and dripping in a nondescript language they call science. Over the years, I have stressed that data must be understood, explored, and communicated with respect to contexts such as trauma, racism, and discrimination. But I have been marginalized and disregarded. When white colleagues express the same or similar concerns, they are elevated and promoted. Recently, I was feeling affirmed after completing coursework in human service design, a supported approach in academic circles. I pitched this to colleagues, and it was met with a bland smile. Another colleague reintroduced it a few weeks later. She was asked to present to the leadership.
We are still, like Carolina said, we are still developing our container or our vehicle, I guess, for our community of Praxis in Minnesota, which you all know is extremely time consuming because we are committed to the process, that it genuinely be community driven. These are very, again, high level, but we do have 3 broad areas of focus. One of them is on this notion of praxis, which is the iterative individual and collective reflection, study, and action. As we create opportunities for that, we believe that a sense of collective identity and critical consciousness will grow. We've already seen that happen just from the play and the few meetings that we've had. We are also committed to creating space for critical discourse and knowledge production. And the crudest measure might be citations, but what we're really looking for is, in the same way that I talked about my daughter at the beginning of the presentation, about critical literacy among evaluators and industries that depend on evaluators growing. So the more we affirm, whether it's through written publication or through facilitated group processes, how do we generate the kind of knowledge that will allow us to repair and reverse the damage that has been done. And the third broad kind of network is on entrepreneurship among BIPOC evaluators. And it's interesting because these 3 categories actually were named in the original Building Diversity Initiative study 20 years ago now, more than 20 actually, and were never implemented. The only recommendations that were implemented from that study were the individual-based recommendations. And so you may know that so-called minority-owned businesses are the largest employer of so-called minorities. And so we do believe that as we generate economic opportunities for racially otherized evaluators to grow their own firms, they will hire members of their communities and economic power among our communities will grow. And so we have to be aware that white supremacy morphs and mutates. And as the landscape changes, we will see that people who are comfortable with the liberal discourse will create ways to ensure that our discourse does not necessarily grow, which we already see actually, because the fruits of the Building Diversity Initiative are now being felt in evaluation with more evaluators of color, thanks to the Building Diversity Initiative. And then we see this real push toward credentialing and certification, right? Which in other fields was an intentional attempt at excluding Jews and Catholics, which is documented in medicine, law, and finance. And we see the rhetoric about reducing supply and increasing demand. We don't see any reflection in the competencies around any understanding of racialized poverty or systemic oppression. So we can expect that to continue. You know, we can respond by not necessarily feeding into the liberal discourse. Right. So when I talked about narratives in the beginning and leverage points, changing narratives is actually the highest leverage point. If you are familiar with systems thinking, we have. So tweaking connections or actors or even, you know, structure does not necessarily change the outcome unless you change the narrative, because the narrative is the boundary. Right? It is the mental model. One of the main narratives that I want to be explicit about is a narrative around justice and oppression. And we're used to talking about justice as if it's a static distribution of power and privilege. We talk about holding power. And when you think about critical connections and generative networks, we're actually talking about the dynamic exercise of power and privilege through socioeconomic relations. So are we continuing to circulate capital in among the same people, or are we broadening the circulation? Are we actually increasing circulation of capital among those who have been excluded from systems? And according to this view of justice, it is the obverse of oppression.
So finally, we share our last example from an IBPOC evaluator in our community of practice. So this evaluator actually wrote this poem a few years ago and was kind enough to share it with us, to share it with all of you today. The title of the poem is, "What is it like?" What is it like to be working with a team of white people, you asked me? Not just any white people, but white people with PhDs and research interests in non-white people. Research interests in people like me. The thing is, you never asked me this. No one ever asked me what is it like to drown in a sea of whiteness. No one ever asked me what is it like to hear white people talk about how they know because they were on food stamps, when they were doing AmeriCorps, or what is it like to hear white people talk about working with at-risk youth, so now they know what it's like to be disadvantaged and poor. And even if you asked me, I might not answer, not because I don't want to, but because I might say it's just in my head. These things I feel are not real. These things I wonder does not mean much, because that's what it's like to drown in a sea of whiteness. The things I feel are not real.
Okay, so I started with the pedagogy of motherhood, and I just wanted to end there as well. So my daughter's in 3rd grade now, and she was supposed to do a play of Aesop's Fables. And so she came home super excited, asking me to practice her lines. This was months ago, of course. They're going to do the play virtually. Anyway, she was really excited about her lines, and she wanted me to rehearse them with her. And she went as follows. Some say that Aesop was an African man that was brought to Greece as a slave, and that he was so clever that he won his freedom. And then she said she thought it was neat that she got to deliver those lines because she's African. And with some poignancy, which I feel even now as I'm starting to talk, I wondered when I should explain to her that the bar for cleverness will keep changing, and that those who have met it historically have not been rewarded with freedom, and that the enslaved had to fight and die for their freedom and for ours, and that slave masters do not get to decide the conditions under which those days enslaved deserve freedom. It's not up to slave masters to award freedom. So my daughter felt kinship with Aesop because she was from Africa, because he was from Africa, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm not grateful that she has now started to internalize first this pattern of association between Blackness and enslavement, and second, this prevailing narrative that the enslaved can win their freedom if only they prove to their masters that they are clever enough, that they deserve it. And so our request of all of us on the call really is that we think of ourselves as the May 13th group. And the only requirement for being in the May 13th group is that we work together to do what we cannot do by ourselves, to create generative networks among those who have been excluded from within our field and the fields that depend on us. I wanted to introduce our local group, Kasira Absar, Tia Bastian, Marguerite Despain, Ann Gomez, Chua Her, Catalina and myself, and Dwaba Unanra. We are speaking on behalf of our local community of Praxis, and we are under the advisement of our elders, Rodney Hobson, Art Hernandez, Hazel Simonet. Oh, Kian Lee's title seems to have disappeared, but Kian Lee from Community Science. We are happy to answer any questions in our remaining time.
Thank you so much, Vidhya and Carolina. You said at the beginning of this call that you were taking us through a journey, and it was, you know, feelings of sadness, but hope and just a lot of awareness. I think that visual that you had around the tree and then the forest in the background just shows, and you're really bringing to light the invisible power of those systems that are really shaping our field. So thank you all for that. So I'm going to hand it over to Tanya, who is going to check in on a couple questions that we're seeing. And I also want to say really quick to Vidhya, Carolina, and your group that there are some folks in the chat who are saying how much appreciation that they have for everything that you're sharing. And a few folks had to leave at the start of the hour. So just wanted to let you know that.
Yes, this first question here that I'm not sure, I'm sorry how to pronounce your name, if it's Jamara, has asked, do the speakers see room for using principles of intercultural communication and evaluation research within, among, and across cultures?
I'm happy to answer that, but I just want to make sure that anyone on any of our group, if anyone wants to chime in, feel free, I guess. Well, okay, so my family is from India, and in India, India is a terrible example right now, actually, of intercultural communication. But it used to be that, at least in my experience, that different groups would communicate interculturally quite often. Okay, and when so you knew that when you were in a Muslim household, you do this, and when you're in a Hindu household, you do this, or when you're in a Christian household, you do this. And so that is intercultural competence. And then when we grew up here, I grew up bicultural, and so I moved. People call it code switching and all kinds of things. So we're very used to moving between cultures, and now that it's become a valuable skill, right now you can, people are trying to get credentialed in it and all of that. But I have a fundamental critique of this as a solution. I mean, I think that's why I said the revolution will not be culturally competent, because the root of oppression is not cultural difference, right? The reason that we even have constructs around intercultural competence is because of the cultural imperialism of white-owned and white-led systems worldwide. So that even when you are in India or Sierra Leone or Bangladesh or Zimbabwe or South Africa, which is all places that I have been to or done work, you have to speak in terms of the Western Enlightenment, okay, about how a problem is approached and how you solve it, how you define it and how you solve it. You never name the fundamental destruction of indigenous knowledge that we had used and the values that we'd used to define our lives. I mean, and again, I hesitate to use Hinduism as an example right now because it is, committing human rights violations as I speak. But in Hinduism and Buddhism, you are not supposed to be driven by your goals. So this whole idea of results-based management and goals, it is not a universal aspiration, right? It is rooted in capitalism and colonialism. Okay, so even this idea of, where are you trying to go to? What are you trying to get at? Even that is coming out of capitalism and colonialism. It's not about European culture unless you want to define European culture by colonialism and capitalism, right? So that's my response to that.
This is Duaba with IBPOC Evaluators Group in Minnesota. I think, to a point that Vidhya made earlier about the ways that the idea of culture, diversity, and inclusion were used to deflect and obscure both race and imperialism and the role that they play in differences and disparities within our field, but within the greater society. First, intercultural competence and intercultural communication. One of the main, to me, so this is just my opinion, but the way that culture is defined within that field is very narrow, and it's purposefully ahistorical and apolitical. And so what if we reframed culture as a political system? So when you talk about Black culture, you're talking about a Black political system. When you talk about Indigenous culture, you're talking about Indigenous people's political systems. When you talk about European culture, you're talking about the political systems that emerge out of European people's contexts. And so if you think about it in terms of politics, then it means that inclusion, cultural diversity and inclusion would mean that there's room for many different political systems to coexist. But it's not possible yet for us to have that kind of world because of what Vidhya mentioned earlier, cultural imperialism, which in this case is the dominant culture or the dominant social group, the dominant ethnic, racial, social group of your context. They set the terms of politics for the people who they subjugate. And so being able to communicate across cultures in this sense would mean knowing how to effectively participate in the politics and the political systems of many different cultures. And so this is not just like, the etiquette and the social mores and the language, but you also know how to show up as a member of a political life of a community. Mm-hmm. And at this point in time, at least in the United States and the Americas as a whole, because of racism, we're forced to participate only in the political systems that have been created by white settler colonists. And to really engage in the work of a generative network is to create space for the political agendas and the cultural lives of Black, Indigenous, Latine, Asian, and all of our multitudes to really be able to both participate as a whole, but also to have space for autonomy for our own agendas to exist too.
Well, I feel like that's a perfect kind of challenge, actually, there's to this group as a whole, and I wish we had like 10 more hours to keep unpacking that, because I feel like you all have really challenged, first from the very start of flipping the question in the title of the webinar, to shift the locus of questions about like accountability. Where does accountability for the inequity and injustice in the field lie, and what does that mean for this? So even the frame shift in the question causes us to think differently about the set of solutions that are proffered, right, to the racial politics and composition and unequal flows of capital in the field. And there's a whole group of funders on the call right now who have a history of investing in it, some of them, right, in efforts, pipeline efforts, and sort of changing the composition of the racial composition of the evaluation field, and have sort of entered that from particular directions. And we're wondering if in our final minute left, the way we could close this is to actually just invite any of you to say, in this moment of opportunity, to connect that generative network idea to what funders can do with their sort of capital related to these efforts. What would you say? What would you like to say to the folks on this call?
I guess we did talk about this as a group a lot. And so I think I would ask for two things. I would ask very plainly for funding, okay, to repair the canon, to repair the missing. And when I say the canon, I don't only mean, the tree. I don't necessarily want to add an appendage onto the tree, but I just mean the suppressed histories of evaluation. I think that's why the discourse and knowledge production network was so important. We do need funding. We need an intentional investment into a network that will generate scholarship around racialized difference and systemic oppression more generally, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum in evaluation and in the fields that depend on evaluation services and products. And since we started one in Minnesota with our growth disparities, despite our number of funders and nonprofits and evaluators, we would be happy to be the guinea pig. We do have ideas about how to test this work. But more generally, this idea of changing the script again from one of deficit to one of Indigenous and subjugated knowledge, right? So we need structures, we need investment in organizations that are willing to experiment with alternative structures, not non-hierarchical and decentralized structures where community knowledge can feed the field and change the field through a change in practice. So you cannot expect the same practices to continue, and just different colored bodies, you can't expect a different outcome from the system. So I would say at a general level, funding for entrepreneurship, knowledge production, and convening critical consciousness raising among racially otherized evaluators. And then more specifically within Minnesota, because we are this sort of crucible, we would love to test that out, right, with a community of partners.
Thank you so much, Vidhya, and for all of the information you shared with us today, and for just being real. I've been seeing some of the stories from the exercise earlier, and then also some people just saying that they feel heard and validated. So I'm just, grateful that you were able to kind of create that space for them, and to just, I love your idea of the May 13th group. I think that's, really great. And so definitely encourage us all to kind of participate in that. And that this is just obviously the beginning of the discussion. Like Tanya said, we could talk 10 more hours about this. So thank you to you and your community of Praxis for being with us today.